Welcome to the Hinkleman Room of the Scranton Public Library. My name is Dr. Ken Mayers. I'm the current president of the board of the Scranton Public Library, and very pleased to welcome Christopher Jen today. He'll be speaking about craftsman architecture, which is actually a subject of great interest to my wife and I. We've spent the last 24 years or so restoring an almost 100-year-old craftsman home. We're not there yet, but we're getting close. So we're avidly looking forward to what Mr. Jen has to say. So without further ado, welcome.
All right, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be in Scranton. Scranton has been on my list of communities that I've wanted to come and do further research and also to basically meet the community and also share what I've learned about architect E.G.W. Dietrich. Some of you may have heard there was a radio interview that I did that was on WVIA. It was called Art Scene. You can go on their website if you'd like. It will give you just a little bit more, I guess, an in-depth look and hear a little bit more from me about the background, how I got started on Dietrich, etc. So if you're interested, that's online and available for you to listen to. So today, really, I'm coming to you to really share what started for me about 10 years ago. When I started looking into this architect named E.G.W. Dietrich. And it all began basically with a house that I was living in out on Long Island in a community called Bayshore. And at that home, I was very interested in finding out about the people who lived there, the owners, and also who the architect was. And so I began sort of searching and digging around, and so finally I discovered actually through a neighbor's house that Dietrich was the architect of both the neighbor's house and this house. And then that everything has snowballed and sort of evolved from there. So this is just a screenshot right now. If you see a little bit of the spreadsheet at the top is how I sort of catalog all of my research that I've done. I'm now up to basically about 450 of his designs all across the country. And there's even one that I found that's in Rome, Italy. So this is something that I didn't think was built, and then it turns out that there are shop drawings with metric measurements on them that's in an archive in Turin. So I think it actually was built. I just have to get over there and dig for it a bit more. But so far here in the US, I have visited 6 different states to go and photograph and actually visit his homes in person. So going into Dietrich as a person, he started out, he was born in Pittsburgh in 1857, and he was born the oldest son of 6 siblings, and his parents were German immigrants, Jacob and Johanna Dietrich. And it's just interesting to look at this drawing at the time of Pittsburgh, because you can imagine what an interesting sort of place this was, a little bit removed from all of the East Coast connectivity of the cities and trade and so on. Pittsburgh was a little bit of an outpost. But of course, at this time period, the industrialization was happening. It was a rapidly expanding city. So he was born almost kind of at the right time period to take advantage of all of this new industry that was coming, and of course, the money that would be involved in new buildings and cities and things making themselves better. And you can see, looking at the population number, just how quickly Pittsburgh was growing at this point. By 1880, it was all the way up to 150,000 people. So it's just really, growing rapidly. So in this setting, you can see here that basically Dietrich in the census here is listed as an architect. This is in the 1880 census. And you can see a photo of his mother, Johanna, that I mentioned. It was a little bit of a rough childhood for Dietrich. His parents ended up having a divorce that happened. And this stems, I think, from the fact that his father was serving in the Civil War. And he was injured. He spent some time in a hospital there, and then after the war, he really turned to drinking. And I think this created a little bit of a difficult home environment. And he then ended up living with just his mother and all of the other siblings. But being the oldest, he sort of had to step up at that point. This happened in 1874. So he, as a young man, then sort of had to start helping and contributing to the family. So what happened is Dietrich decided to go, and he attended Duff's Business College, which was in Pittsburgh. And the interesting thing with this situation at the business college was that they would have local architects in the community that were there teaching courses on drafting and drawing. And so he took part and started from those at this young age. And he also attended the Western College of Pennsylvania, which is now the University of Pittsburgh. So some of these professors that he had this connection with through the school, being practicing architects, he was able to then apprentice and sort of start an internship under them. And of course, at that time period in architecture, that was really how you came up into the industry, is you worked for somebody else, you would have an apprenticeship period. But of course, you had to have skills and things naturally, I think, as well. And Dietrich certainly was skilled in this regard. He ended up really becoming a great delineator, as they called them back then. He would be doing the drawing, and especially presentation drawings, watercoloring, and so forth. You can see here the first drawing that we have of Dietrich's from 1879. This drawing is held by the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. And what's interesting with this is that it's not an original design of his at this point. He's actually just copying a home that was designed and already laid out in an architecture periodical by another architect. But this was sort of a practice study for him to learn how to be doing the drawing and the watercolor techniques that he would need. So as he begins his work, he basically decided to leave from Pittsburgh and take a break and go to New York City. So I think being young and ambitious, he thought he'd go on the road and really, hit it off and start his career off. And interestingly, he was able to do quite well. He had several drawings that were published at that time, but it didn't last for too long. He was really only there for a few months in 1881 to 1882. And then basically he came back to Pittsburgh again and started working for the office of James T. Steen. So you can see here a drawing for a YMCA building that was going to be built basically in the downtown Pittsburgh area. And if you look really close, I've blown up there, you can see Dietrich's signature at the bottom that he was the author, he had done that drawing for Steen's office. So the next thing then after this original work and sort of this apprenticeship is wrapping up, he joins with Charles Bartberger basically to start a partnership, and they have an architecture practice together. Bartberger was the son of another Bartberger, Charles Bartberger, the elder one, and he was an architect as well. He had designed many projects around Pittsburgh and had a good following of clients and had a good reputation. And so what happened is, I think the Charles Bartberger brought a lot of the clients and the name, and Dietrich really brought the design sense and the skill in the drawing, and they ended up having a successful practice together. So here we see Dietrich. This was, I think, taken at the time of his wedding to Eliza Estelle Melhorn. You can see her on the left. She was the daughter of a very prominent Lutheran minister. They were married on November 12, 1884. I think this might have been one of the reasons that he ended up returning as well from Brooklyn to Pittsburgh, but that's just conjecture. So talking a little bit about his practice, Dietrich worked basically in 4 styles through the course of his career. And as we analyze and sort of look at these now through architectural history, we like to make categorizations or say why one thing is one thing or another. But at the time, these boundaries were really much more fluid. There wasn't like such a strict line necessarily between the shingle style and colonial revival. There was a little bit more, and a lot of houses and buildings you'll see that have evidence of both. But basically there were these 4, the shingle style, the colonial revival, craftsman, and then finally arts and crafts. So talking about shingle style, just to give you some basics, I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen this sort of style house before, but just to point out some of its characteristics, this was a style that was unique to North America. It's really something that evolved here from the American culture. And it was really starting by looking back to the colonial buildings and a lot of the sort of almost like vernacular that you would see with shingle work and wood and sort of salt box design of houses on the East Coast. So the architects at this time period really wanted to look away from all the ornament of the Victorian designs that had been, really built all over the place and overused at that point. So they started to look to these natural materials and also asymmetry, breaking away from that previous design sense in Victorian. Then also grouped fenestration. So basically we're talking about the windows. And you'll see in these examples that rather than having individual punched windows, the windows are starting to be grouped together. And it just gives a much more horizontal line and a horizontal look to the building. The other thing that's important in the shingle style is there's lots of outdoor space. So there were porches and piazzas, loggias, balconies. So it was really about trying to bring a connectivity between the inside and the outside. Outdoors and nature was not something to be afraid of or stay away from. It was really something to be embraced and to kind of have a healthy lifestyle in that regard. So I just like to read a quote from Dietrich. This appeared in Cobblestone Building, that was the name of the essay, in 1887. It was in the American Builder and Woodworker. So the design should not be one of those gingerbread-looking designs, but should be a bold treatment and outline shorn of all unnecessary detail, such as flimsy cornices and other unnecessary effects on the part of the designer to spoil a bold roof line or wall space. So this is really Dietrich saying, let's turn away from all of that over-ornamentation, that mass-produced trim and molding and gingerbread, and go with really more of a pure form of architecture. So an example of that you'll see is the George Macbeth House. This was built in Pittsburgh in 1884. And you can really imagine that if you have your sort of traditional Victorian design and then this house is built next door, it would cause quite a little bit of a shock. And of course, that's what happened. When these new Dietrich houses would go up, people would actually come to see them just because they were so special at the time period. This house remains today, and you can see a photo of the existing home. What's quite fascinating and special with this, I think, is that rather than using wood shingles that we were talking about, there's actually slate shingles that are used on the wall surface. So what you're seeing is actually a beautiful red slate stone, and it has a little bit almost of a sheen on it that you see. The sun catches that reflection. But again, just even the balance of the house, you see that there's this central gable at the top, and it's sort of offset from the mass of the rooms underneath it. So it's really creating kind of an energy and dynamism and doing something very different from what was being done at the time. Another house from this early period is the E. Court Williams House, which is in Cincinnati. This was built in 1885. You can see the drawing here. The house is covered in all sorts of different types of shingle work. And this is a picture of the house today. The owners of this home actually are in the middle of starting an exterior renovation project, and they've started to take this old siding off that's covering up the original shingles, and believe it or not, all of that shingle work is underneath. So in the next year or so, this will just be an incredible thing to see, because all of those original shingles, they're putting back the balustrades and the porch railings, everything will be amazing. You can see here from the interior, the work has already been completed on the inside, and really just this amazing woodwork in detail. And again, Dietrich at this young stage of his career is really experimenting and trying out some interesting different things with the designs. The brackets that you see at the corners of the doorways here, every single one of them in the house is actually different, and they're different on each side. So there's just all of this really imagination and energy that's going in. So what happens is by 1886, Dietrich is sort of having a good stream of success with Bartberger, but he decides that it's time for him to leave Pittsburgh and leave Bartberger and move to New York City. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in just a minute about what exactly made him and drew him to New York City, but it's actually the same forces that also brought him to do work here in Scranton. So when he leaves in 1886, he relocates to 294 Broadway. He'll practice in New York City for the rest of his life, even though he lived in Brooklyn. And the interesting thing is that over the course of his career, he ends up having several other architects that he's partnered with or associated with, but it's never quite the same formal connection that he had with Bartberger, where they were very, very formal business partners. Instead, he sort of teams up casually over time. They work together for a while, then he goes back on his own again. So the next style of his that I'd like to bring our attention to is the Colonial Revival. Colonial Revival, again, stems from we were talking before about this colonial architecture in the shingle style. Sort of this is even a more literal interpretation going back to the colonial and even Georgian styles. In 1893 at the Chicago Exposition that took place, there was a real look of like the city beautiful and looking to this sort of classical architecture. So the Colonial Revival also owes some of its origin to this. And what happens is we start to see a return to more symmetrical massings of the overall buildings. There are large porticos on the fronts of the homes. There's decorative fenestration, sort of those spider web windows that we see. Ornamental balustrades that are present on roof lines up at the top of the house. And then, of course, dormer windows are also a very important part of this style. So one of the homes that I really like to point to as being a transition between the sort of shingle style into colonial revival is Nutwood, which was the McConnell House in Morristown, New Jersey, built in 1891. You can see some drawings here of the home, and this is a picture of how the home looks today with some interior views as well. You can see that fan window that's on top of the staircase there, really giving sort of a colonial revival element. But yet some of the other forms in the asymmetry are a little bit more from the shingle style, even though the house is then in the clapboard siding, which of course is back to colonial. So we're seeing a little bit of a hybrid in this home. Originally, it had a lot of those balustrades and decorative railings that were taken off over the years. For his own home, Dietrich decided to build in the colonial revival style. His home he named San Donona, which is basically a mountain in upstate New York in the Adirondack. So that was the name that he gave his home. It was located in Bensonhurst by the Sea, which was a community that was planned along the New York Harbor. It was eventually absorbed by Brooklyn, and then Brooklyn was eventually absorbed into the greater New York City. But at this time, it was outside of the city bounds and kind of its own community. His home was completed there in 1891. And what's interesting to take note of for me is while we're looking at a colonial revival style house, when you look at the volume, if you take a look at the floor plan down below, you'll see actually none of that symmetry. In fact, the porch is sort of pushing under on the first floor. So he's still using and still working with some of the lessons that he learned from those shingle style floor plans with open rooms and things with a entry hall that's not just formal, it's sort of used as a space. There's a fireplace, there's benches, and he's sort of cloaking that or sort of cladding it with this colonial revival style on the exterior. You can see a drawing of the grand staircase there in the entry hall. And then in the next image here, you'll see an actual photo from the home, both the exterior and then that interior view again of the entry hall. So this is a photograph of the Dietrich family. It was taken in 1898, so you can see Dietrich himself, his wife Eliza Estelle, and then their sons. The last son, George, is not pictured here, but otherwise this is just before he was born. He was born in 1900. So you can see at the time they were a very well-looking, well-dressed family. Another great example of a colonial revival home is in Warwick, New York. This is the Knolls. It was built for Solomon Johnson. This house, again, has a lot of those elements we were talking about, the grand portico, the railings, the dormers. And this is how the house looked in reality in a photograph. So I'd like to go and take a little bit of a deeper look in Warwick, New York. Basically, you'll see here there are the two Wisner houses. They're side-by-side homes that were designed in 1884 and built in 1885. And I'd just like to read this quote about them from the Warwick Dispatch. Situated on the western side of South Main Street stand two houses which attract the attention of all who pass along the street. So entirely unlike are they from what the eye is accustomed to see, and so pleasing to the lover of picturesque effect in color and outline, that one never tires in studying them, always finding some new point of interest. So these homes, when they were built, drew a large amount of attention. And I think the great benefit, too, is that they were only about an hour away from New York City. So they were able to have people from the greater metropolitan area be traveling here, industrialist business people, and they were written about, and people would come and then want Dietrich to design a house for them as well. So the owner of the home on the left from the previous picture, the house was called the Anchorage, was Clinton Wisner. And what's fascinating with Clinton Wisner is he eventually ended up becoming the president or mayor of the village of Warwick. But his story starts much earlier. He was actually born in Pittston, just down the street here. And it was quite funny when we were doing the taping of the interview with WVIA, because they're in Pittston, so we felt right at home. So Clinton Wisner, even though he was born in Pittston, he locates eventually and lives in Brooklyn. And his family, though, going back to colonial times, traces their heritage back through Warwick, New York. So he also had a close connection with that community just outside of the city. And Clinton Wisner is really the force that I think brings Dietrich from Pittsburgh to New York, and then is also the force that brings him from New York to Scranton. So this is a photograph just of how that house looks today. You can see these beautiful shingled arches that carry through for the exterior. You can see the name Anchorage written up there on the top. And of course, this really interesting roof line, which was something that he mentioned before that he really likes to pay attention to and is a signature of his style. Right next door, there was a home for his cousin. Again, I said these were side-by-side homes. His cousin was Louise Wisner, and she also was from Pittston originally. And I think they had a close relationship as cousins, having grown up together, so they decided to have these two homes set side-by-side in Warwick. And this is how that home looks from the outside today. Even with the white color paint, of course, originally this would have been stained, the shingle work. You can still see all of the amazing details, right, with all the different cuts of the shingles. And additionally, sort of the arches carrying through even into that porch that's on the second floor. And then finally, a little bit of a partial arch that's in the porch up on the third floor. So this is how the whole connection to Scranton, or at least one of them, starts. So talking about Wisner, who I just mentioned, his father ended up marrying a woman named Sophronia Pierce. Wisner's mother passed away when he was very young, so his father got remarried and had additional kids. Sophronia Pierce was the daughter of Horatio and Sophronia Pierce of Scranton. And they were very wealthy at the time. They were industrialists. They had a lot of money. And in 1889, Horatio passes away. And what happens is they need somebody to take care of the estate, settle all of the different investments, and basically, distribute everything to the heirs. And so they look to basically Mr. Wisner's son, Clinton, who we were just talking about before, to be the person to handle that estate and settle everything out. And so this is really where that connection comes from if you look at the chart, because we have the cousin Louise Wisner to the right-hand side, and then to the left-hand side of Clinton Wisner, we have Kate Wisner, which was his half-sister from this marriage, and she ends up marrying Henry Kingsbury here of Scranton as well. So we have this connection through Mr. Wisner, who was very close with Dietrich, to suddenly bring that work and make this family connection through the Pierce family here in Scranton. Part of the will from the Pierce family was basically to fund a rectory for St. Luke's Church. And you can see that that building is basically to the upper right that you see there, built in 1890. And Dietrich was hired to design that rectory. So he also had another entree into the society here through that connection. And of course, I mentioned the cousin, Louise Wisner. She marries somebody named Thomas Jones. And they build a house here in Dunmore in 1887 to 1888. This house's name was called Fieldstone, which is very appropriate given all of the stonework and special stone that's used all over the building. You can see the original drawing here, the elevations by Dietrich of the house. This is Louise Jones here standing on the staircase in the home. And then Thomas Jones, her husband, he's sitting on the front porch. And then we have basically a photo of the home shortly after it would have been completed. Obviously, the landscaping has grown in, but all of the architectural elements in this photograph are the original. You can see the beautiful porte cochere that's projecting from the front with this sort of arched, screened opening at the top. There's some lattice work that's being used both to screen porches and then also decorative lattice work that's used on the curving tower you can see there at the bottom. And then I think most interesting is the sort of large turret with these small little poked rectangular windows that are through there. So I think on the third floor and having these windows really gives an interesting effect from both the exterior, and it has a practical effect because the third floor normally would have been reserved for the servants to stay in, and so you're doing a little bit of screening, not having too much visibility to them from the street. And this is how that house looks today. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's at the corner of Green Ridge and Adams. So I was very lucky from the Jones family descendants to basically have them share with me some photographs of the home. So this one, rather than showing today pictures, I thought it was really much more interesting to show some of the historic interiors and what it looked like originally. So you'll see the two photos on the right. One is the entry hall, which is the picture on the top looking towards the staircase. The other one that you see down below is taken from the dining room and sort of looking through that entry hall. And again, you can see that the rooms are furnished in sort of, still a very, traditional, style at this time period. But what we're starting to see is some of the formality opening up. We're having large openings with pocket doors so you can move between the spaces normally. And then if you need to divide rooms up, you can close those pocket doors and have different things happen. These are two more photos, one of the dining room that you see on the top, and then the library. This would have been Mr. Jones's library on the bottom. And then a photograph here of the staircase, the beautiful stained glass windows, and then the sort of balcony or gallery space at the top of the stair. And looking at the plan to the left, you can see how there's this large open space there in the floor plan. And this was something that really Dietrich does over and over again in his homes. And it really creates a beautiful open space at the top, brings in a lot of natural light to both the lower entry hall down below and the upper space. And at the same time, I think, it makes a almost gathering space on the second floor for the family without having to go down to the formal rooms. So following that in 1889 to 1890, I mentioned the rectory for St. Luke's. So you can see the church here in the middle. Many will be familiar with the church from Wyoming Avenue, and then you can see the rectory on the left-hand side. Unfortunately, the rectory isn't there anymore. It was torn down. There's currently, I think, parking and a park that's located there. But this was important to us because it's one of those projects that Dietrich did here. And then obviously the parishioners of the church were introduced to him. They saw his work, and it helped him to get other projects in Scranton. So one of those other projects was for Everett and Ellen Willard Warren. This house is on Monroe Avenue. It's been modified over the years, so it looks a little different now than its original did. But you can still get an idea of what this house must have looked like in its heyday. And also it's interesting that on the interior when I visited, even though it's being used for a different purpose now, if you go down in the basement, you can see the original stone foundation walls. And then after the family got a little bit more money, they then built them out a little bit further and added on to the house. So you could see how its footprint expanded over the years. There's an interesting tie-in with this house. You can see seated here is Mary and Marjorie Scranton. And she was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Warren. And so she was, of course, very important as the mother of the future governor of Pennsylvania. And of course, in her own right, she had many political involvements and things that she did herself. So I just wanted to, bring attention to that tie-in. Also for the Warren family, Dietrich designed this beautiful arts and crafts style home up on Lake Placid. So this was where they would go and spend summers. And you can see a photo on the left of it back when it was first completed, and then on the right is how it looks today. Despite being a camp, as they're termed, this was called Calumet Lodge, the home is quite large. You can see from the floor plan the large rooms. Again, wonderful design up here for this style of architecture because you're losing the formality, you're having these beautiful spaces, and of course these open balconies with the raw timber looking out to the lake. So I wanted to now just talk a little bit about North Park. So going into detail about some of the neighborhoods within Scranton where Dietrich designed houses, North Park is an area that was a development within Greenridge. So this is basically heading out from downtown here on Washington Avenue. And what was interesting is this had been farmland for quite a long time, and Arthur Frothingham had the idea with his father to go out and buy that property with the development of the new streetcar line run by electricity that was going to be coming. They thought that it would be an ideal place to kind of have new homes be built. There would be a lot of property available. And so they basically laid out Electric and Sunset Streets with these beautiful sort of curving, medians in the middle with park space. And that was the beginning of their development after they bought the property in 1889. Frothingham teamed up with Robert Hurley and also with E.B. Sturgis. And Sturgis is interesting because he was also connected within the streetcar line itself. So he was sort of double dipping in terms of getting some money from the streetcar and then also building the houses at the end of the line. But it was a good strategy because he was quite successful with that. And you can see from the map, basically in orange are all of the current homes designed by Dietrich in this area that are standing. The ones that are in brown are ones that have been demolished or were never realized, they weren't built. So taking a look at this, I'm going to go in more detail and we'll talk about each one of these. This is just sort of the rest of the list because there were too many to fit all on one page. So one of the first houses was on North Washington Avenue. E.B. Sturgis hired Dietrich to design this home, and it was Edmund Boyle who lived in the house, built in 1889. Many of you will recognize it from those distinctive rectangular, square punch windows at the tops of the turret again. So it kind of reflects back to fieldstone. And I think it was really Sturgis seeing fieldstone having been built just a few blocks away that was like, hey, we need to get working with this architect and bring him over into our project. So this is one of the first of their development homes that was built in the area. And you can see here the exterior. I took some close-up details on the side. It's a little hard just because of the way that the landscaping is done to always get a close view, but it's really remarkable, some of the shingle work, trim, and so on that's happening on not only the front, but the sides and other faces of these homes as well. So I mentioned that Robert Hurley was one of the developers involved in North Park, and this was a home that Dietrich designed for Hurley himself on Electric Street. What's interesting with this home, you'll see in the photo in just a moment, but if you look at the plan, there's this beautiful sort of rounded room that's facing to the side, and that basically on both floors really has dramatic windows looking out to the lawns and garden. Here you can see a view of the house with that sort of rounded side, and a little bit of a modification in the design as it was built with a long porch being extended sort of to take advantage of the outdoor space as well. And like other Dietrich homes that I've been talking about, you can see the beautiful staircase, this again being a main feature of the house, and the beautiful stained glass windows that are up on that second floor, letting in a lot of natural light. Also on Electric Street, one of the early homes was built in 1889 for W.W. Patterson. So I think rather than this house actually being commissioned by Patterson, I think that Hurley and Sturgis built it and then Patterson soon after moved in. Patterson was also involved with Sturgis in several business ventures, including the railroad, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is just taking a look at the home as it looked like when it was first completed and today. The original shingle outside has been stuccoed now. That's actually a common thing that happens sometimes to shingle finishes, is that they get stuccoed over. But you can still see the main form massing, and of course that arched entry still exists today. It's interesting to take note of the plan in this house. You can see as you come in the entry hall, there's a staircase to one side, and then you'll see that there's kind of an angled wall with a fireplace and a niche. This theme of these three rooms, the entry hall, dining room, living room, and sort of this triangular fireplace, carry through in several of his designs from this time period. And I think part of this might be that he was so pressured to design these houses quickly because there was such a demand for them being built right at this time period that he liked the plan. I think Sturgis and Hurley must have liked the plan, and then they worked different exterior elements to make it look different. So these are some views of the staircase on the interior, the stained glass windows. And directly across the street, we have the home for Watts Cook and Clara von Blaircombe. This was built in 1891, so a little bit after the first one. But you can see again sort of Dietrich's signature prow window on the third floor, and again the interesting roof massing. And it's also worth taking note this beautiful curve that we see in the roof line and the porch that sort of engages you to come in and marks where the entry to the house and the porch are. So this is a watercolor done by Dietrich of this design. This is not actually the Van Blaircombe house. This design dates back a little bit earlier to 1886 when he was still working in Pittsburgh. So I think this home may have been built also, another version of it in Pittsburgh first, and then he modified it a little bit and built it here in Scranton. But if you look here at the plan again, basically you can see sort of the interior of the space. You can see that the beautiful fireplace that we're seeing, and again, the window seat with the stained glass windows. This is one of those features that it was creating little nooks and crannies, places that you could sit and read a book or spend time scattered throughout the home, whether it's in the library and the dining room or perhaps the entry hall. And another house that he did in the neighborhood is the Charles and Annie Lindsay home. You may not quite recognize this home from Washington Avenue because it's been renovated and modified a little bit since I took this photo. This is from a few years ago. But I wanted to show this one rather than the current just because it has a little bit more of the original features showing. So you'll notice on the bottom floor that there are these beautiful sort of shingled arches that frame each end of the porch. And one of the interesting things is where the arch actually continues and sort of stops off. So it's not a completed arch, it's like a kind of almost like a buttress that's going out. And this is a drawing for a very similar home that Dietrich designed in Rutland, Vermont. And you can see the similarities basically between this and the other house. So really I wanted to use that old photograph so you could see the original design and then sort of how it looked when it was drawn. One of the fun things that we turned up and I brought to the library's attention as we were proposing this presentation was that Dietrich did a proposed drawing, it was not realized, for the Green Ridge Library. So most of you today will know this is the Nancy K. Holmes Library in Green Ridge. You can see the actual built building there in the photograph. This was done by Lansing C. Holden. But it was just interesting to know that Dietrich, even back at this time, was also involved, and probably, other architects might have submitted plans as well too. But you can see what his idea for the library there would have been. Another North Park home, unfortunately, it was torn down and is no longer standing. Was built for John and Catherine Burke. And this is a colonial revival style house. Again, you can see those elements I mentioned before with the balustrade at the top, the dormer windows. But it really had quite a strong presence on the corner. And if you look at the Sanborn map, you can see where it used to stand on Washington. So one that does still stand on North Washington is the William and Amelia Kennedy house. This home, in its original shingle form, you can see the beautiful shingle work and this unique sort of second floor arched balcony to the left-hand side. It again has the third floor prow roof that's on top of those windows at the front gable. And it has a very distinctive gabled entry coming into the porch that really emphasizes the front door. The photo that you see in the bottom right there is of Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy standing in front of their home soon after it was finished. And then this is a drawing of the home, just having a look at how Dietrich envisioned it originally. You can see it was built almost identically. The original floor plan is shown as well. And then we see how the home looks today. And again, one of these beautiful staircases in the entry hall. Unique to this home, and it wouldn't have been unique at the time, but not so many of them still stand, there's a beautifully designed shingled carriage house in the back. And for a city lot, it was kind of great to be able to get this room. There was horse stalls inside of this. And I'm certain that Dietrich would have designed this as well, just looking at the design elements and the way some of the windows are, particularly the little gable at the top with the little teeny sliver window up at the top there. A little bit later, in 1896, we have the E.F. Marsh House. This was on Columbia Street. So what happened is, in 1893, and some of you may know this, the U.S. suffered from a really terrible sort of economic depression. And this was really a shock because things in the 1880s had been going so well. There was all of this industry, people were making a lot of money, but suddenly the bottom fell out. And this lasted for several years. So what happened in this case is that a lot of the building and architectural work at this point was put on pause. People were waiting until the economic condition improved to build again. And we see that reflected in the work of Dietrich's here in Scranton. So there was a pause really after 1893 until you get to 1895 or so when the houses continued again. So this is one of the first ones that would have been built after that period. It's located on Columbia Street, which was again sort of the phase 2 development for Frothingham and Hurley and Sturgis. The things to note again on here, just similar to the other homes that we've seen, is you see that special roof up on the top. Again, we see some of those partial arches that are coming out to support the part of the gable that's overhanging there. And one of my favorite elements is the screened-in porch on the corner. And you can see how interesting it is that that shingled archway interrupts the roof line as it comes across. So that was really meant to make a statement. You could have just as easily lowered that and not have it do that, but he wanted to emphasize and really make that archway stand out. So the entry area into this home is really just stunningly beautiful. You can see the gorgeous stained glass that's decorating the staircase here. And there's this small bench that's just very diminutive inside that's built into the woodwork just at the bottom of the staircase if you were waiting for somebody to come down to dinner. And another interesting feature is that the decorations on the columns that you see in front of the staircase on this screen wall are copied in the fireplace. So I think there's a real unique, all of this is all custom designed and it would have been drawn up by Dietrich. And just taking a look at some of the other rooms in the house, you can see the front parlor on the left, some of the stained glass in the dining room, and this is just a view from that bench I was mentioning, looking across to those matching column capitals. So Dietrich also designed a house for Charles and Nellie Smith that was located out in Elmhurst, which is a community just outside of Scranton. And this would have been sort of a resort area where people wanted to get away from the heat in the summertime. They would go out to this neighborhood. Unfortunately, this house is no longer standing, but I was quite excited to see that Dietrich had this additional design in the area. So moving on, we've sort of covered the North Park and Greenridge area. The other emphasis of Dietrich's work was in the hill section. Of course, this is much closer to downtown, and this was already kind of an established residential neighborhood at this time. So I already mentioned to you St. Luke's Rectory, which is number 1. Again, on this map as well, the brown circles that you see are houses or buildings that are no longer there, and the orange ones are houses that are still present. The Everett Warren House we talked about, and we'll go ahead and talk about the Taylor House and the Ammerman House and so on in the next slides. And additionally, we have these other homes. Again, they couldn't all fit on one sheet, but you can see just how many of them that were located in the hill. So here's a view of a neighborhood or a street that was called Platt Place. And you, of course, all are familiar with the train station, one of the landmarks here in Scranton. But you might not be familiar with the residential houses that you see just to the left there. This street was basically laid out in the 1890s, and it was just behind the Scranton estate. And this originally had been the home of the Platt family. So if you're familiar with Scranton history, of course it was the Platts and the Scrantons together that sort of founded the modern city and were investors in a lot of the early industry that existed. So what happened is the Platt family then decided to, after the parents had passed away, they didn't want to be living so much in the downtown area, so they turned it into a residential street called Platt Place, and it was divided up for these homes to be built. Dietrich designed 2 homes on Platt Place. The first was for Carl and Isabel McKinney, and that was at number 4 Platt Place in 1891. And you can see this beautiful home, very unique in a way because even for a fairly narrow city lot, there's a lot going on here with the arches on the porch. We've got this octagonal turret that's on the corner. And of course, these asymmetrical windows, both in the gable and then just below. It's again showing Dietrich sort of playing around with all of these elements. And right next door at 3 Platt Place, there was the Robert and Amy Reeves home. And I'm very fortunate to have a photo shared of that home from the 1930s when the house was then serving as a boarding house later on, obviously making sense with its close proximity to the train station. But again, like the house that you saw before, there's a lot of interesting details happening here. Eventually, these homes were bought by the University of Scranton, and they were used for student offices and other sorts of things. And then eventually, when the new bridge was built over the railroad tracks, and everything came through with the expressway, it was torn down to sort of widen the entry and the sequence to get onto the roads. So this sort of stretch of residential area was lost. We're very lucky that this house was not lost. This is the David and Mary Taylor house. This is located on Clay Avenue in the Hill, and it really is just a stunning home. You can see here that there is a lot of these design elements we're now familiar with Dietrich's work that are evident. We have the rounded arches both in the entry area. We have this interesting turret on the side with these sort of side circular protrusions next to the window. And of course the prow and dramatic roofline at the top. I wanted to share some earlier drawings that I came across of the home. This is actually taken, the one on the right, it's an elevation view from the side, and there was originally supposed to be an even larger tower that was facing towards the other street. In reality, when the house's final design was put together, that tower was left off. You can see here some historic photos of the home after it was first completed, a view from sort of the front entry and then from the side. And a fascinating thing with this plan that I'm really interested in is every single woodwork in the room is listed. So you can see that some rooms are in cypress, there's cherry, there's walnut. So it's just amazing to think back of all the different materials and woodwork that was used and to have this sort of record in the plan of how each room was decorated. So this is a view of how the home looks today. Again, you can see the special, decorative work on the tower here, the beautiful stone arch over the entrance, and that stonework carries around on the ground floor as well. Some views of the woodwork on the interior that I was mentioning. Of interest is this sideboard that you see in the center. This is a sketch by Dietrich for the dining room, and then you can see in the photo on the right that it's still there. It was built per his drawings and was actually integrated into the room. So it's really great when you see a record of something and then it's actually still there when you visit the home. It's quite a treat. Another interesting home just kind of across the street, kitty corner from this one, is the house for Lemuel and Ella Ammerman. This home is interesting because, again, it's one of these colonial revival homes by Dietrich, but at the same time it had a little bit of a different feel in the floor plans and not quite the massing that you would expect. So as we take a look at the floor plans on the right, you can see that there's a little bit of a push-in at the porch. The rooms, again, are sort of irregular. There's this beautiful circular reception room that's shown. And later families after that then expanded the house a little bit. So you'll see that the front portion of the porch was filled in, and then basically a wraparound porch was added later. And then you can't quite see in the photos, but the dining room, and there were even some other rooms that were expanded out. So I mentioned before the Wisner family and Kate Wisner. She was the half-sister to Clinton. And she ended up marrying Henry Kingsbury, and this was the home they had built by Dietrich, basically at the corner of Monroe and Olive Street in 1893. This home is quite interesting because of these sort of Flemish design elements that are used on the gables that you see. And the original drawing that you see here gives a little bit more of an impact on the different colors and materials that would have been used on the house. So that brings us really to the Platt family, who I want to talk about next. And they were really important, people in the history of Scranton. They were investors, capitalists, industrialists, and also they owned some good real estate. So if you look at this image of the hill, of course the neighborhood is down at the bottom. You'll see kind of to the left-hand side at the top of the hill 2 homes, and these were both homes that were built at the very top for the Platts. So the first home was built for Frank E. and Elizabeth Platt. And you can see the drawing here, the watercolor by Dietrich on the side, and this is Mr. Platt in the photo. And for those of you here in person, you can see the original drawing is hanging on the wall here in front of us as well. So this house was built in 1897. This is a photo of the home just after it was completed. You can see how small the trees are. But it was situated, as we said, really on top of this hill. And even from Webster, where the street that passes in front, it's still up lots of steps and another hill at that point. But because the Platts were, family members, it was a brother and sister, you can see in the drawing that there were walkways and connecting drives and so on. So these two homes, even though they were separate, really functioned as kind of one compound for the family where they could walk back and forth to each other. These are some drawings that we have from the interior of the Frank Platt home. You can see, again, the beautiful arrangement of the rooms, and particularly the beautiful staircase in that sort of semicircular turret in the front. And then to the side, we have some sketches of the interior. And this is the second floor plan. Again, that large sort of gallery space on the second floor, and some additional photos of the house when it was built. Unfortunately, this home was lost to us, I think, back in the 40s or 50s, so it's not there any longer. But the next house that we have next door by the Platts is still standing. This was built for Frank's sister Ella, and later it passed on to their nephew, Frederick Platt, and he lived there for many years up until the 1950s. You can see it was built in 1898, and really just a beautiful home. Now, sort of a total contrast to the other Platt home. This is done in the colonial revival style, but you can see the sequence of entry would have been quite dramatic, coming up to this beautiful ornate porte cochere and entering the house from the side. This is a view of the home today as you look at it from Webster. You can see that beautiful yellow warm brick. It was fascinating to get up close with this home, and you'll see it in the next photo. The joints on the bricks are so tight, the craftsmanship and detail at the time period to get the tolerances of the brick and then to have the masons be sort of fitting everything so close together really is remarkable to see. Additionally, there was this beautiful colonial revival balustrade work, finials and ornaments that were put on the house. And everybody that I've talked to from Scranton about this home has a childhood story about the turntable. So you can see here I had to include a photograph. Because this was at the top of the hill, you could go up the driveway, but there was really no way to get back down again. So this turntable was installed and allowed either carriages or cars eventually to be able to pull on and be turned around before they would go back down the driveway again. And this just shows you a floor plan of the house as it was built. And still to this day, it looks very much the same on the inside. You can see the grand entry portico on the front, but also what the family would have used, the porte cochere that's on the side. And they had a beautiful now glassed-in veranda to come in that side entrance. And the design of the entry hall really is an L shape. So it's quite nice that if you were coming from the formal front of the house or from the porte cochere, you kind of met in the center and had equally grand entries from either side. Again, a grand staircase in this home that you see here in the plan, and that large gallery space on the second floor. So these are some pictures. You see the formal front door on the picture on the top left. The bottom left is the door that goes out to the porte cochere underneath the stairway landing, and you see this beautiful staircase and landing on the second floor. All of the woodwork panels in this entry hall are bird's eye maple. And it is just absolutely stunning that this hasn't been painted. You go up and see it in person, and it's this beautiful textured bird's eye maple. I can't imagine the cost of this originally when it was built. I mean, it's very special. And then we have a special feature on this home as well. You'll see this interior window. And this is something that's a little bit of a puzzle when you first look at it. But I think there's kind of two effects of this. This is my thought on it. One, I think it helped to obviously share interior light through the space. So these large entry halls had a lot of natural light coming in. So you would borrow light from that space. The other thing that I think is interesting, it gives almost a little bit of a courtyard or outdoor feel when you're standing on the staircase and the landing. And because these were such large spaces and rooms, it's sort of interesting that you would have this feeling of almost being, quasi outside when you're passing through. This is then taking a look at the dining room. The dining room is finished in some more dark woodwork, but you'll see these pocket doors that go between the main rooms out to the entry hall again. And it's just amazing again to have sort of the beautiful inlaid bird's eye maple panels. And another unique feature are these columns. So pocket doors, you would think you didn't want to make the opening any bigger than you had to. The pocket doors actually clear, so the columns are freestanding when the doors tuck away and are open, and then they're made extra big so they come in and close behind the columns as well. So it's just, again, sort of an exaggeration of how much money and quality could be spent on this. So nearby in Wilkes-Barre, there was a home that was designed for Dr. Levi and Cornelia Shoemaker. So it's interesting, Mrs. Shoemaker was a Scranton originally, and she was cousins with the Platts. And so there's a familial connection again between these two homes, and you'll also see even in the design that they had similar tastes. So taking a look at this building, it was built in 1896 on South Franklin Street. This is a view of the home shortly after it was completed, and you can see it was actually Dr. Shoemaker there in the photo. And then now we see the house as it looks today. The house functions today as the Westmoreland Club. So after the Shoemakers stopped living there in the 1920s, the Westmoreland Club bought the home and took it over for their own uses. So what's lucky with this is that the interior rooms and spaces are really in great condition and are just beautiful. You'll see here some of the interior spaces on the inside of the club. So it's a treasure that this is really in such great condition and being well maintained. So the interesting thing that I discovered is, and I keep saying interesting, but this is really interesting, that Dietrich actually did a design for the original Westmoreland Club. So before the club moved into the Shoemaker's house, in 1897, they basically had a competition with 4 invited architects to design the original building for them. Dietrich's design that was proposed is the watercolor that you see on the left. He did not win out of those 4. And it actually went to a local architect by the name of A.H. Kipp, who was from Wilkes-Barre. And so you can see his watercolor that basically won the competition. And then just in the drawing of the map that you see here, the Sanborn map from 1910, the Westmoreland Club, as it was constructed originally, is the building to the far right, and then on the far left is the Shoemaker House. So eventually, when the Shoemakers passed away in 1920, the club decided they wanted to have different quarters. They moved over into the former home, and then the church, which is the building in blue, took over the former quarters of the Westmoreland Club. So a little bit of musical chairs happening there. One of the people who helped all of that happen was an architect by the name of Clark Wright Evans. So Clark Wright Evans came late to architecture, but he worked for Dietrich in New York at one time in his office. He was sort of a main chief draftsman for him. And then when the house in Wilkes-Barre was being built, I think that basically Clark Wright Evans would have been on site and sort of helping out with some things here locally. After the Shoemakers passed away and the transition to the club happened, he was actually hired to come back to the club, and he did the expansion for the sort of ballrooms and large public spaces that were added on to the back of the house. And if any of you have visited, again, they're kind of seamlessly integrated together. The brickwork on the outside matches, so it was a very good choice that he came along in the 1920s and did that work. His own home that you see is pictured here with the brown shingle work, and I can't help but see some of the similarities to Dietrich's other work that we've looked at. So I think that when he was working in that office, he was obviously absorbing some of the architectural design style. Coming back again to the Hill here in Scranton, this is a house that was basically designed for George and Grace Smith in 2 versions. So Dietrich came up with this first version that you see here, and when I first saw this rendering, I was like, I can't believe this would have ever been built, because it's got like everything thrown on it, you know, turrets and gables and chimneys, and it's really got a lot happening. But if you pay attention to the plan that's up in the top, it's interesting to note that when we look to the house that was actually built here for the Smiths, it looks completely different, right? The form of the house, it's much more simple. We're now in a very clean colonial revival style. We have sort of this grand 2-story portico on the right. And this is a photo from the time that the house would have been completed. But the house actually uses the floor plans from the original design. So Dietrich overlaid on top of this the floor plans. And this is just one view of that you'll see, which is the 2nd floor gallery space again. This is a drawing by Dietrich looking at the interior of the staircase. And just the detail on this with the cat that's laying on the rug, the little girl, the mom it looks like who's over, and another one of these interior windows that's looking into that central space. So this is a view of the house sort of from the other side of the street looking at it. But you can see as you see the plan, the general layout with that rounded room in the back with the balcony on top. Everything sort of is borrowed or taken from that original first concept, and it's just kind of wrapped again and evolved into this other design in terms of the exterior. Unfortunately, this home has fallen into a bit of disrepair today. It's really hard to recognize that this was the home that we were just looking at before. I think over time it sort of became apartments and then was divided up for different uses. But you can see here the original door. The front door still has all of this ornamentation from the historic home. And even inside, some of the fireplaces remain. So despite the outside sort of being added onto in some insensitive ways, there are some interior elements that are still there. So beyond the Wisner family that I was talking about before, there's one other connection between Dietrich, Scranton, and Warwick that we were talking about, that village up in New York, and that was Thomas P. Fowler. Mr. Fowler was the president of the New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad, and he had his country estate located in Warwick. This was just sort of right down the road from where Mr. Wisner's houses were built. And basically in 1889, he hired Dietrich to come and take an existing home, do renovations, expansions, add some outbuildings on. So there was this relationship that was developed between them at that time. An interesting thing to note for those of you that are interested in trains and railroads, there was a very fancy sort of private parlor car that the railroad had at that time. And Fowler, being the president, named that rail car the Warwick. So it was just a connection back to the village where he had his country house. So as we look at the railroad map that you see here, this is cutting through basically Scranton is down at the very bottom left and heading up north to Hancock, New York, which was where the New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad ran, basically from Middletown in New York going all the way up to Lake Ontario. And they were really interested in getting their hand and their trains into the valley here to access the coal. And that was really a big money source for them, transporting coal and shipping it from Scranton and surrounding areas out of the valley and to points either west towards Lake Ontario or east to New York and New England was really desirable. The problem is that they were passing too far north of Scranton. They didn't have a route in. So what happened is in 1889, Mr. Sturgis, who we were talking about before, the developer of North Park, basically was the president of the Ontario, Carbondale, and Scranton Railroad, which soon merged and became leased and coordinated with the New York, Ontario, and Western. And they proposed this railroad route that would come down to Scranton to access the coal in 1889. So construction started, and basically the railroad line opens in 1890. And of course, Mr. Fowler, who had been working with Dietrich on his country house, hires Dietrich to come to do many of the passenger train stations that were built along this railroad line. So you can see again the same color coding. The orange are the only two stations that are still standing. All of the brown stations that we see were taken down at some point. All of the stations except for number 9, so 1 through 8, all had a very similar design. And you can see on the left sort of Hancock and Starlight and Preston Park. All of these railroad stations were basically made off of the same template. And this was one for efficiency of the railroad because they wanted to get this thing up and running right away. And the other is that this was never primarily designed for passenger service. It was mainly to get access to the coal. And so they were sort of doing their passenger service as a secondary means of income. And since you were running the trains, it made sense to have passenger service as well. And you can see here the other stations that all ran along this route. And then we've got some drawings here looking just up close at these design of the stations. And then just 2 weeks ago, I was able to actually drive up here and have a look. And they're located in some beautiful rural countryside area. And especially with the leaves this time of year, it was just amazing to see. But they are in good condition. They're both protected. And one of them functions as sort of the township offices. That was Starlight. And you can see here, this is Wynwood or Lakewood, as it was called. 1890, and the train line is actually just on the left there. It's now turned into one of these rail to trail. So it's actually a stop. You'll see people on ATVs coming by or people walking nearby. So the station that came on the line at the very end, a little bit later in 1891, was the Carbondale station. And I wanted to put a few pictures together just to explain to you the conundrum that the railroad had. So they were coming in, and they were the last railroad through the valley at this time. And they had to somehow find a way to get through town, to get a station built, and to get access. And so the location of the red dot that you see there is where the station was proposed and eventually built. And the railroad made a big trestle that went through town and basically bridged across the river and sailed right over these other railroad lines that were coming through town. But the problem is, how do you get the people from the city down below up to the railroad tracks? So basically, Dietrich designed a 3-story train station that you can see here. And it came in at street level. There was an entry porch that you see, also a porte cochere, so the carriages could drive right up and let you off. And then just beyond the porte cochere, I'll show you in the next image, you can see there was a platform and a door for taking your baggage and loading bags. So it was very civilized. You would be able to pull up and enter very, in a nice, grand way. Taking a look at these historic plans that we have here, you'll see that there were 2 elevators that were located in the building. And so at this time period, it must have been great to have these steam-powered elevators. One was used just for baggage going up and down, and the other one was used for passengers to bring them up to the platform level. So continuing on beyond just the Scranton area, one of the houses that I wanted to just show again from the shingle style is the John Mollenhauer house that is in Bayshore, New York. And this is the house that I mentioned originally kind of brought me into my Dietrich research in the beginning. You can see here what the home looked like in 1893, right after it was completed. And this is a view of the house today with some of the interior spaces. So you can see the beautiful shingle work, the prow-shaped windows again, and those arches on the porch. Another wonderful home of Dietrich's up in Jamestown, New York, was built for Robert and Elizabeth Marvin. I had the pleasure of giving a presentation for them last year to that community about my research. You can see this is how the home looks today. After Mrs. Marvin's death, the home actually became a women's club of sorts. They have different social groups that are able to meet there. It's a meeting place for women's organizations in the community. So again, this is a wonderful home because everything is preserved and intact inside. This is a view from the corner, and then some of the interior features. And again, that 2-story entry space. The stained glass that you see there is actually the skylight that you see at the ceiling in the home. Another shingle-style home was for William H. Ray. This is also in Bayshore. Interesting with this home is, again, it's kind of right on the border starting to become colonial revival in style. There's some of the elements with the decorative windows that you see. And certainly the interiors as well. I just want to point out the staircase and things. So this brings us to his next area that he worked in, which was the arts and crafts style. And arts and crafts came from Europe. It was really popular in the UK in the beginning. And it was not just a style for architecture, but it was really about design overall. It was furniture design, it was textiles, it was artwork, and there was even a philosophy involved in arts and crafts about how you treated workers and having, great social aspects as well, that everybody should be treated as an important person. So they kind of had some idealistic visions at that time. Again, it was turning away from the mass production we talked about, and they really liked to sort of express structure. If something was made from an oak board, you showed the joinery, you showed how that was made and put together. And again, there was an emphasis on sort of this new style of living and new home life. So Dietrich worked with Gustav Stickley on designing a house together in 1903. And this was a unique relationship because Dietrich, of course, had this background in his architectural design, and as his style was moving and he sort of entered into the arts and crafts style, it really was where we start to get sort of this more what we call today the craftsman style. And this name comes to us from Stickley's Craftsman magazine. That was what he really used to promote his philosophy and also his furniture design. And that was also the name that they gave to the first house they worked on together. It was published in May 1903 that you see here. What happened is that Dietrich did all of the drawings and he designed the architecture of the home, and they basically populated the renderings and images with Stickley furniture. So they were showing the way that you could arrange rooms differently, that you could use this very modern furniture and this new style throughout your home. And you can see from some of those earlier interiors from the 1890s, this is really only 10 years later, but it's a very different vision for the way the home is decorated and for how we're using spaces. One of the other arts and crafts buildings that Dietrich worked on, again in Warwick and again with Mr. Wisner, was the Red Swan Inn. It was built in 1902. You can see that this was sort of one of these sprawling, beautiful shingled surfaces, a lot of interesting roof lines. And the interiors really had a lot of these craftsman type aspects, and also the furniture that was used was from the craftsman period as well. This is a photo of the exterior. And I think it's just amazing, this wing that comes out. Eventually, later on, it was enclosed, but originally, without air conditioning, that was meant to be just this 3-sided open-air porch where you would be escaping the city, spending the summertime there with those nice breezes. This home was in Jamestown, New York, and it was for Arthur K. Briggs. And this, again, is representing sort of this, arts and crafts style of Dietrich's, although we can still see some of those elements from his earlier designs coming in. Here's a photo of how the exterior looked when it was built, and then some of the interior spaces. And of course, one of the really charming spaces in any home is the area at the fireplace. And Dietrich really liked to emphasize sort of the lifestyle and seating spaces around his fireplaces. So this house has a wonderful ingle nook in the living room. You can see the sort of built-in benches on each side to sort of sit and take advantage of the fire. The Luther Turner House in Torrington is another great example of his arts and crafts work. You can see the stonework here in the exterior. And then finally, I want to go to Altoona, Pennsylvania. This was an arts and crafts bungalow. This is 1917. So now we're jumping ahead kind of another almost 10 years. These homes are interesting to note because what's happening is after, kind of the end of what we would say, or the tapering end of the, industrial Gilded Age when there was a lot of money, and especially with this arts and crafts that I was talking about and this more emphasis on society, Dietrich's work turns to some smaller or more modest homes. I mean, I think if any of us saw this, it would still be very beautiful and large, but compared to the earlier ones, it's a little smaller. So the watercolor for this one from 1917 really is charming in that it's more diminutive, and for the first time we're seeing really just a one-story form with a second story with that little eyebrow window. And here's another bungalow from 1917 in Mayville, New York. This is special because you see how sort of dramatic the interior is. So even though it looks diminutive on the outside, there's some beautiful woodwork and spaces on the interior. And then in 1919, there's this house that's in Monroe County. So this is just a little bit south of us here in the Poconos. And if anybody recognizes this home, please get in touch. I have been searching and looking, trying to find if it was ever built or where it might be located. But you can see this beautiful brickwork. Again, the roof lines, really, arts and crafts design, very close to the arts and crafts that we'd see in the UK. And complementing that, we have one of the interior rooms that Dietrich did a watercolor for. And again, from those earlier designs, just seeing the simplicity and the brickwork of the fireplace, the decorative color tiles behind, but still keeping some of the, things like the window seat that we see here. So going to Dietrich's personal life a little bit, one of the things that I want to touch on is a tragedy that came to his life in 1914. You saw that photo before with all of those sons. One of Dietrich's middle sons, named Emerson, really, I think, showed the most promise of following in his father's footsteps and becoming an architect. He had planned to attend Cornell and go to architecture school there. However, plans sort of went by the wayside when he visited a lion tamer doing a show in Brooklyn at one point. And he ended up meeting the female lion tamer who sort of had the lions and decided that he was going to go off and be her assistant. So they were traveling around the country sort of doing almost like this vaudeville circus act. And there's various stories that have come about, and of course different newspaper accounts, and you're not quite sure who's right. But whatever happened, on June 21st, Dietrich was killed basically in the lion's cage in the train car when it was in Chicago at the Chicago yards, basically trying to make its way back to New York. There's one story that says that there was a jealous assistant and that the two were engaged and they were coming back to the parents to tell the architect Dietrich that they were going to get married. I don't know what he would have thought of marrying the lion tamer. But in any case, it's a tragic, terrible thing that he was killed, and this really had a horrific impact on the family because this was one of their sons that they really thought was going to go somewhere. So it's not really clear what happened. There's a private investigator that thought he found a bullet in the body. It's really something to be explored further. But this did have a profound impact on Dietrich, I think, at this point, because his work kind of from 1914 really started to change. And I think it was not only, through this event that happened, but we have to remember, of course, World War I started. So there was a change, that was going on with the country and sort of the economy and people going off to war. We also have to think as well about the pandemic, the Spanish flu that was going on at that time period, which also, as we all know now, has a profound impact on society. So that was causing a change as well. So Dietrich's work after this, it again goes to those smaller arts and crafts houses that I was showing. But of course, one special project he did was a church in the town where he was living in Freeport, New York. And this is Christ Lutheran Church. The building was actually started construction in 1925, completed in 1926. This is a view of the exterior with this this is actually Pennsylvania stone that was brought to Long Island to be used. Dietrich did not live to see the church completed. He died on Christmas Eve in 1924. He was still working and he was on his way into New York City. He was waiting for the train. And unfortunately, he had a heart attack on the platform before the train arrived. His wife Estelle had passed away a year earlier, and so I think there's a combination really of her loss obviously having an impact, and fortunately he didn't make it to see his church get completed. In any case, the good news is that they did follow his design precisely. You can see the drawings and even his original specifications, and it was all built according to his intent. So I just want to close with an extract from an obituary that was written for him in the AIA Journal, published in May 1926. This brief outline of his career will perhaps mean little to those without knowledge of his personal qualities. He was a man of sterling character, kind, considerate, always a gentleman, ready to render service or give advice to anyone who asked, and to work for a worthy cause. In brief, to know him was to love him, and his passing was a grief to his many friends who held him in their highest esteem. So thank you very much for your patience. I just want to let you know that you can go to my website. I update this fairly regularly with things that are going on in terms of events or further research I'm doing. It's very easy to remember. It's just egwdietrich.org. And I'd like to say thank you to everybody. I really owe a big thanks to all of the homeowners that were so kind to open up their homes and let me come through and take photos. It is so appreciated. I also want to thank, there are just so many people who have been sending me information on the trains, on the railroad stations, on some of the homes. It's just amazing that there's so much information out there, and for us all to connect and sort of making contact and assembling the information together to share with others is really extraordinary. So thank you all very much, and I appreciate your attention today. So I think what we're going to do now is we can open up the floor a little bit to some questions. If anybody wants to ask, we also can do some questions over Zoom. So I don't know, maybe we'll start here. Is there anybody in the room that has any questions they'd like to ask first?
Chris, there were a lot of floor plans and renderings. Could you describe how the working drawings?
Sure. So just to report for people on Zoom if they can hear or not, the question is that we saw a lot of the presentation drawings, the renderings, the exterior views, and floor plans. But what about the working drawings? So the working drawings were executed in great detail, not so different than from today. I mean, obviously not using Revit, but it's interesting that several homeowners that I've met have the original drawings of their home still. So they were rolled up and either put in the attic or in a shelf someplace. So I have scanned and have several examples of the real working drawings and specification books. And they're very much like we would expect. There are sectional drawings, there are plans, there are elevations, details. I mentioned the project in Rome. And when I contacted this archive in Turin and they said they had drawing, I was like, what do you have drawings by Dietrich for? It's amazing to see all of the woodworking details for every single little piece of a bench, the balustrade. A lot of times fireplaces that I would think were just ordered out of a catalog, there are drawings for the fireplaces and the woodwork. So his homes typically, for most of them, were all custom designed start to finish. Then, as I mentioned, the specifications. One interesting story with this is I was in a home and the specifications called for pocket doors. And the owners said, well, we don't have any pocket doors. And turns out when we looked, there were hidden cavities that had been covered over with trim where there had been pocket doors before. So they were very accurate and very precise.
How did you come about this list? Did you find a master list of Dietrich's works in his archive? Or
So do you mean in Scranton or you mean everywhere?
Everything in your home.
Sure. So the question is just about how I came up with the 450 projects of his. Over 10 years of work. So there was no list of clients. There was no list in an archive. It really was house by house by house coming across and finding them. Dietrich was a prolific publisher. He worked very, very hard to get his drawings put out and published in the architecture periodicals of the time. So it wasn't like you hear sometimes about these mail catalog orders and it wasn't that type of a business, but it was more for, the architectural community, his colleagues and peers to look at. I think there's a lot of cross-pollination that happened. People would be looking at what different architects in Boston or other architects in New York were doing. But the great thing is by publishing, he would oftentimes list either the owner or he would list the city where the house was built. And so that gives me the first, and it's really great if they do both. So what ends up happening then is if I have an owner's name, I'll go start it into genealogical sites and going to the census, and I try to find out where that person lived in whatever town. So for example, in Scranton, I would go to the census and find out that, so-and-so, Mr. Kennedy, lived on North Washington. Then I would go to North Washington on Google Maps and start looking down the street, and there it is, and then you would see where the house is. So it's really a painstaking, crazy process in a lot of ways. I mean, some of them were quite easy if it's the only big house in town. Places where it's more urban, like Scranton or in New York City, it takes a lot more digging and it's a lot harder because you just can't visually start looking over, from an aerial view or anything like that. I have had homeowners contact me that have drawings or have a record, and then there's been a connection made that way. So there's sort of several different ways it's come together, but unfortunately there was no master list. It's been literally putting together each design that I come across and then trying to figure it out.
Any idea of the cost of some of these houses? Did you come across that at all? The original cost of?
Definitely. So the question is about how much the homes cost at the time of their construction. So what would happen a lot of times, there's a document or publication called the Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide, and Columbia University has it all digitized. So that's another great source to look, and you can see Dietrich was building a house in some city. But what they would do, because they were focused on the real estate and the contracting industry, is they would actually list a lot of times how much a house cost. So for a more simple wood frame, sort of house, that would be, let's say, probably around $5,000 at that time. For some of the bigger homes, the Platt house that we were looking at with the yellow brick and so on, that would be probably closer to $25,000 or $30,000 at the time. So what was really expensive is if you were building out of brick or stone, that added a lot of value. Also, obviously, depending on your level of interior decoration, the more fine woodwork, the more fireplaces, more stained glass windows, that all added cost on too. So I would say it's somewhat in that range. If you do the math and convert from back then to today, I mean, it was still a bargain. The prices back then were very low compared to what it would cost to build a house today.
What do you know about the extent to which the interior and exterior decorative elements were fabricated, or either prefabricated or fabricated on site in general during this period of construction technology?
Sure. So the question is just about interior elements and how they were fabricated and where.
And exterior. And
exterior. So I haven't gone into a ton of research in that regard, but what I can comment on specifically, I don't know if you know where Kane, Pennsylvania is, and up near Warren and Jamestown. So when I did my presentation up that way, in Kane, there used to be a very, very famous millwork company that was located there, and they would do interiors all over the country, woodwork in Washington, D.C., and New York, and the finest places. So I have records and references to some of Dietrich's millwork for the Jamestown houses and the Warren houses, and he did one in Kane too, being done by that facility there. So it would say that, Mr. Marvin has 5 mantles that are being, designed, not designed, but being fabricated by that company. So Dietrich would do the drawings for those, but then they would go to that special millwork company with all of the woodwork and do the crafting there. So that's just an example for that one geographic area and sort of how things would happen in that case. I would guess for the most part that, there were a lot of local lumber companies and lumber fabricators around in those days. I know from my area on Long Island that the contractors who sort of got to build some of these larger homes were working directly with some of these local lumber companies. So they would be doing the lumber cutting and lumber work locally, and then it would just be brought over across town to be assembled for the houses. So it's not an area that I've gone into a ton of research on exactly where everything comes from. But I do know that there were, it's just very different than today. Each small community at that time had so many more resources and they could do so many more things locally, whereas today it's much more, isolated and things get shipped from far places and so on.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Do you know if Dietrich spent any time here in Scranton, or would he have done all this from his offices in New York?
So the question is if Dietrich spent time here in Scranton. So he definitely did. There are newspaper accounts of him coming here. I'm sure he would have made visits to all of his locations. So when he was working up in Jamestown, The local newspapers, a lot of times they report, so-and-so is visiting from this city or that city. So there's references to Dietrich making trips around through different phases. So like at the beginning when the house is first starting construction and foundation work is going on, and then coming to the home later. It shows him actually coming and being a guest at that house in Elmhurst. So he came for this, and made a summer visit out to Elmhurst and stayed at that home there, visiting the family after he designed their home. So I think there were also some personal relationships that developed from these, situations of client and designer as well. Go ahead.
I'm just curious, the houses when they were built at this time, what kind of roofing materials did they use? Because it seems to me that some of them would have had slate maybe, and some of them would have had wood shingles or asphalt.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the basically asking about the roofing materials. So the majority of roofs at this time that I've seen in the residential construction is really using wooden shingles. So they would be using, special cedar shakes. Of course, we have to think that back then this was virgin wood product that would be coming from California or Oregon from the West Coast. So it's old growth, original trees, much, much more durable and so much stronger quality than what you could get today, because unfortunately this was virgin timber that was being harvested, and the rings and just everything is, it's so much more strong and weather resistant than what we have today. The other thing that would happen is there would be a lot of creosote and other stains that would be used on all the shingle work, both on the roof and on the wall surfaces. So it's interesting that this would add color. So you might have a dark green roof, or you might have a red shingle roof. But that stain also act as a great preservative. They would soak it in this, and it would really be sort of treated in this chemical process to be much more resistant. I think as well, you're right, there would have been stone and slate used as well. But for the most part, on the shingle style in particular, and then going into the colonial revival houses, at that time period, it was mostly all wood shingles.
Where did the renderings come from?
Oh, yeah. So everybody also, just please feel free to take a look at the ones that I brought with me today. So they're from my personal collection. I'm very lucky to have acquired Dietrich's archive of drawings. So I just brought a couple here today to share with everybody. You can get up close and have a look at his work. All right. Oh, sorry.
When you were talking earlier about the specific things to his designs, are those things that he patented, created himself? Or is it things that were out in the world already designed that he just kind of brought in as an amalgamation into his design?
So the question is about his design elements, and if they were things that he invented himself or something that he took from other places that he saw. It's both. It really is both things. Obviously architects at this time period, there was a movement going on. He was not the only architect or even the most preeminent architect working in the shingle style. But he was certainly doing something very unique and special with his work. I think, again, like I mentioned, with the architectural periodicals, there were shows that would happen. Architects would exhibit, for the public to come and see, for other architects to see. So there was a whole discourse that was happening. And I think that just like with buildings today, you would see what somebody does over here or over here, and that informs your choices and what design decisions you make. I have to say that for me, there's something, and maybe for you all too after seeing this, is there's something I think distinct about Dietrich houses, to the point that when I'm visiting one house that I know about in a neighborhood, I'll just kind of glance in the other direction and see a roof line or something through the trees, and I'm like, I better go check that out. So you go and walk over, and sure enough, it turns out, and I find records, and it's another Dietrich house. So it's something in that way where I think there was a unique talent or skill of his in putting things together in a certain way and using those elements. But obviously the arches on the porch, many people did arches on porches at that time. His specific detail of the way the shingles, though, connected, and he sort of put a recessed shingle work as it went across the top, I think that was very unique to him. I haven't seen other architects quite do that same detail, which is a very elegant, and right away if I see that, you're kind of 90% there that you're looking at a Dietrich design.
When is your book coming out?
So the question is about when is the book coming out? So that's certainly my next goal. Really, with all of this research, is to put everything together and write a proper monograph on his work. I'm really excited because obviously with the new drawings that I have now, on top of my previous research, it really assimilates and brings all of those things together. Honestly, it's just sort of getting my foot into the publishing business and finding out how a publisher works and all of this. But I hope that there would be an interest from the community as well in putting something together on him. So, go ahead.
So I'm curious because there's a house on the corner of Delaware and Adams, about a block from the Fieldstone house.
Yes,
That was A.B. Sturgeon's son's home originally.
that's absolutely right.
Is that one?
I don't know. I have strong suspicions that that home, we're talking about a house here in, it's actually in Dunmore technically, it's right on the border. I just learned where the line is, it's very hard, between Dunmore and Scranton and Greenridge there. But this is E.B. Sturgis that I talked about, the property developer. His son had a beautiful home built, I think it was in the late 1890s. And it bears a lot of resemblance to Dietrich's designs, especially Fieldstone nearby. It has beautiful stonework. I've contacted the family, but I haven't really heard back from them yet. So I haven't found any direct connections. There are some elements on the house that do look very much like Dietrich. There's some ornamentation where it's a little bit decorated in some places, a little bit away. You know, there's applied florally things. So I'm not 100% sure, but definitely one that I will follow up on. And you've got a good eye. All right, Jenny. Oh, sorry.
Speaking of that house, there's one directly across the street from it, up the corner, the last house in the 1600 block of Adams, and a much smaller home.
Okay.
But I think it was a
Well, if anybody
family
has,
relationship.
absolutely. If anybody has any other suggestions, please share them because I'm always looking, and then I can start doing the investigative work and so on. Jenny, do you want to take some?
Yeah, there was actually a question about the frame design on your renderings and where you updated them.
So I did not do the framing. I was very fortunate that when I got the drawings, they came with those frames already on them. They're beautifully done. They were made in upstate New York, and they sort of followed the original Stickley craftsman style, both in their detailing and in the treatment of the wood. So it's very special, and it's very appropriate to be able to showcase. I think it really makes the designs pop. All right. Well, thank you all very much. This has been wonderful.